Alexander Sterling wasn't born a trillionaire. He was born invisible. Growing up in the suffocating grip of poverty, he learned early that the world only respected one thing: power. He watched his father break his back for pennies, only to be discarded by a faceless corporation when his health failed. Standing at his father's grave at just 16 years old, Alexander made a silent vow that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would never be at the mercy of another human being again. He built his empire not out of ambition, but out of absolute terrifying fear. Every company he ruthlessly dismantled, every competitor he crushed, was just another brick in the fortress he was building around his heart. By 32, he owned skylines. He dictated global markets. He was a self-made titan who answered to no one. To the world, however, he was a visionary. But behind the custom-tailored suits and the cold, calculating eyes lay a man who had traded his humanity for absolute control. And the highest price he paid for that control was Elena. Elena was the one variable he couldn't manipulate. She loved the man, not the bank account. But to a man obsessed with invulnerability, her genuine love felt like a dangerous weakness. 2 years ago, standing in their glass-walled penthouse, he handed her a set of divorce papers. He told her she was a distraction from his grand vision. He systematically erased her from his life, boarding his private jet with the cold satisfaction of a man who had finally eliminated his last vulnerability. What he didn't know as he flew away that rainy Tuesday was that his true legacy was already growing inside her. My Elena's world after the divorce was a masterclass in silent survival. While Alexander dined on white truffles in Monaco, she was sitting at a scratched formica table in a damp, freezing one-bedroom apartment, rationing out cans of soup. 8 months pregnant, her body was a map of exhaustion. But the psychological toll was heavier than the physical one. Every night she would look at her dwindling bank balance, a paralyzing fear gripping her chest. How could she bring a child into this struggle? But a mother's strength is forged in the darkest fires. Elena didn't have a trust fund to offer her baby, so she offered an unbreakable spirit instead. She took a job at Laura, the city's most exclusive, demanding dining room. For 10 hours a day, she carried heavy trays of champagne and Wagyu beef, her swollen ankles screaming in sheer agony. She swallowed her pride as wealthy patrons snapped their fingers at her, treating her like invisible furniture. She counted every single penny of her tips, placing them in a cracked glass jar on her kitchen counter. That jar was her child's future. It was a slow, agonizing grind. But every time she felt a tiny kick against her ribs, the exhaustion melted into a fierce, protective fire. She didn't need $1 trillion. She just needed to survive. Fate, however, is the ultimate architect of irony. On a freezing Friday night, the ambient hum of Laura was broken by the arrival of Alexander Sterling and a table of ruthless investors celebrating a brutal corporate buyout. They demanded the center table. They demanded absolute perfection. In the sweltering kitchen, Elena wiped a bead of sweat from her pale forehead. Her back flared with sharp electric pain. She balanced a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes and pushed through the heavy wooden double doors. The dining room was a sea of velvet, diamonds, and expensive cologne. She kept her eyes glued to the marble floor, focusing entirely on putting one worn-out shoe in front of the other. As she approached the VIP table, a loud, booming laugh echoed through the room, a laugh she would recognize in her darkest nightmares. Elena froze. The breath was violently knocked out of her lungs. Slowly, agonizingly, she lifted her gaze. There he was, the man who had discarded her. Alexander's cold, calculating eyes casually flicked upward. For a split second, there was no recognition. Then the realization hit him like a freight train. The color drained completely from his face. He saw the cheap uniform. He saw her exhausted, hollowed eyes. And then, his gaze dropped to her stomach. The absolute, terrifying truth anchored him to his chair. Elena's hands began to shake uncontrollably. The heavy silver tray tipped. The crash was deafening. Crystal shattered across the floor. Champagne pooled around Elena's worn-out shoes. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. The trillionaire, who negotiated global treaties without blinking, was entirely paralyzed. "Watch what you're doing, you clumsy idiot!" one of the investors barked, a wealthy man in a silk tie waving a dismissive hand at Elena. Get the manager. Unbelievable incompetence. The insult snapped Alexander out of his shock. Something primal, something he had buried decades ago, snapped violently inside him. His chair screeched against the marble as he stood up. Shut your mouth, Alexander snarled. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a terrifying, deadly whisper that cut through the silence like a scalpel. The investor shrank back, horrified. The entire dining room went dead silent. Alexander dropped to his knees in his $10,000 suit, right into the puddle of champagne, desperately reaching out to the woman he had thrown away. But Elena pulled away as if she had been burned. With a quiet, unshakable dignity, she stood up, brushing past him, and disappeared into the kitchen. He chased her out into the freezing alleyway, pulling out his checkbook, begging her to let him buy her a house, a hospital, anything to fix his guilt. But Elena just looked at him with profound pity. She let his blank check fall into the muddy puddle at their feet. You still don't get it, Alexander, she whispered over the pouring rain. You can buy skylines, but you can't buy time, and you certainly can't buy a father for this child. When Elena walked away that night, Alexander's fortress finally crumbled. He realized his money wasn't a superpower. It was a cage. For the next month, Alexander Sterling vanished from the corporate world. The board of directors panicked, but he didn't care. He traded his custom suits for a simple wool sweater and jeans. He didn't try to buy Elena's forgiveness. He knew she would reject it. Instead, he had to earn it the way normal people do, through time, patience, and humility. He started small. Elena woke up one morning to find the broken, out-of-drafty window in her apartment building's hallway perfectly repaired. The next week, the intimidating debt collectors that had been calling her suddenly stopped. He didn't grandstand. Every night at 11 p.m., when her shift ended, he parked his unassuming truck across the street from the diner. He never approached her, never crowded her. He simply watched, acting as a silent guardian to ensure she walked to her bus stop safely in the dark. Elena noticed. She saw the most powerful man in the world sitting in a freezing truck for hours, just to make sure she was safe. Slowly, the thick ice she had built around her heart began to show microscopic cracks. She wasn't seeing a trillionaire anymore. She was seeing a man desperately trying to learn how to be a father. But redemption is never simple. In late December, the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. A massive, historic blizzard slammed into the city, dropping 3 feet of snow in a matter of hours. The power grids groaned and failed. The streets became impassable death traps. Inside her freezing apartment, Elena lit a single candle. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, shivering violently. Suddenly, a pain so sharp and blinding ripped through her abdomen that she dropped to her knees, screaming. Her water broke. It was a month too early. Panic, cold and absolute, set in. The phones were dead. The roads were closed. She was completely alone in the dark. Outside, Alexander had been sleeping in his truck, refusing to leave her street during the storm. Through the howling wind, he saw her solitary candle flicker and heard a faint, terrifying cry. He didn't hesitate. He fought his way through waist-deep snow, his hands numb, his lungs burning. He kicked through the frozen main door of her building and took the stairs 3 at a time. He burst into her apartment to find her on the floor, terrified, tears streaming down her face in the candlelight. Alexander's heart hammered against his ribs. There were no private doctors to call, no VIP hospital wings. His billions were completely useless pieces of paper. It was just him, the woman he loved, and the freezing dark. He dropped to his knees, taking off his heavy coat and wrapping it tightly around her shivering shoulders. He took her hands, looking deep into her panicked eyes with absolute, unshakable certainty. "I've got you," Alexander whispered, his voice the only warm thing in the room. "I ran away from my fears once, Elena. I will never, ever run again. I am right here." Through the blinding pain, Elena squeezed his hand, finally letting him in. For the next 10 hours, as the storm raged outside, Alexander held her. He wiped her brow. He anchored her through every agonizing contraction. They weren't a trillionaire and a waitress anymore. They were equals. When the storm finally broke, and the first golden light of dawn hit the frosted window, a new cry echoed in the small room. A tiny, perfect baby boy rested against Elena's chest. Alexander looked down at his son, tears streaming down his face. He touched the baby's tiny hand, feeling a profound, soul-shaking wealth that no bank vault could ever hold. Some men build empires of glass and steel, but the luckiest men build families. Alexander Sterling was finally the richest man in the world.